I want to ask you if you can relate to this. You graduate from FC, you're young, you start preaching the gospel, you get married, you're young, vivacious. All of a sudden, someone you go to school with becomes a teacher at Florida College. And you say, how can that be? We're too young for that. But then you congratulate him, and you move on. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he becomes part of the administration, a dean. And again, you say, we're too young for that. He can't be a dean at Florida College. Well, I have Jason Longstreth to thank for both of those reality checks there. Most speakers will tell you, I'm glad to be here, and I am, but I'm glad that you are here. When I first got this assignment early on, I knew exactly what assignment this was, what time slot, that I would be going against some veteran preacher that was speaking about his years in preaching, well known. I didn't know it was Brother Harkwriter at that time, but I started recruiting people to come to my lecture since that time. And it was wonderful to be here to see the exodus out of the doors across the Red Sea of the parking lot to Brother Robert Harkwriter. So I'm glad that you're here. I'm glad that you're here because my lecture is on judgment. And from my experience, people don't like lessons about judgment. They'd rather not hear about judgment. In fact, a lot of people are so afraid of judgment that they just stay away from it or ignore it altogether. And that's kind of the irony, that those that are afraid of judgment are the very ones that need to be afraid, not of judgment, but they are the very ones that need to fear the Lord, who takes away that fear of judgment. So I'm glad to be here as well. I don't know how many of you saw the news report on Sunday afternoon. In my staying at home in my Yorba Linda home, there was a plane crash. And I calculated it's just about 1,500 feet from my house. And as a reserve firefighter, I usually do not respond on calls on Sunday, but because of the particular nature of this and how close it was, I did to see what kind of aid I could render. But I'm glad that you're here, especially, because my lecture is on figs and on a fig tree. And when I got this assignment, I was thinking, I don't know anything about figs. I better learn something about figs. I'll tell you, I didn't grow up with figs as part of my daily diet. If I'm honest, I grew up on cheeseburger, French fries, and shakes. In fact, I remember as a young boy traveling out of state in California that there was this billboard. And this billboard said, coming up, world's most famous fig/date shakes. And I was thinking to myself, why would you ruin a great thing like a shake by putting figs in it? The closest I ever came to eating a fig, I think, was a fig Newton. But I liked that, so maybe I would like figs. So I understood that I was going to have to learn more about figs and fig trees than I ever wanted. Not that I'm an expert now, but in the end, I was glad to have this study. In fact, I want to take you with me through this study, because there's some things that I saw in this study that I never really noticed before, never really appreciated. And so I want to take you with this study with me. Figs are not a big part of our own diet here in America. In fact, figs are only grown in California, Texas, Utah, Oregon, and Washington for the most part. And even then, they are not a big part or called for a lot. But that was not the case for the people living in Palestine in the days of the Bible. Figs were a major part of ancient life and a stable food source. Figs and fig trees are mentioned some 60 times in the Bible. Everett Ferguson writes, "The olive, the vine, grain, and sheep were the basis of the agricultural economy of the Mediterranean world." Now you'll notice in that quote, I didn't mention figs, but in studying figs, I have to believe they were a close second. In fact, I want you to notice in our study this morning how often fig trees and the vine are mentioned together. It's hard to find a passage where they aren't both mentioned together. In fact, I think that a lot of that was because the fig and the grape were some of the sweet fruits. They were kind of the candy, if you will, the natural candy of the Palestinian world. They were one of the most important plants for the Israelites, being grown throughout Palestine, especially the mountainous regions. I want to engage you in this lesson by asking you certain questions throughout this lesson. The first question I want to ask you is, as you've studied the Bible, did figs jump off the pages of the Bible to you? Have you even really recognized and remembered about figs or fig trees in the Bible? I would tell you, I didn't. And so the first thing that we do in our study is we say, well, let's look at some figs in the Bible. How many of us remember Adam and Eve, after they sinned, they covered themselves with leaves. But Genesis 3:7 tells us it was fig leaves. And we always talk about the forbidden fruit. What was it? Well, it's always pictures of an apple. We don't know if it was an apple. We don't really know any of the fruit trees. We know there was a fig tree there. The 12 spies brought back not some fruit, but clusters of fruit to show that the land of Canaan was exactly as God described it. They brought back a cluster of figs. In Deuteronomy chapter 8 and verse 8, to describe Canaan as that wonderful land, it is described as a land of fig trees. Remember when Hezekiah became deadly sick? He prayed to God and God extended his life. Well, Hezekiah was healed from that deadly disease, obviously because of the will and the power of God, but 2 Kings 20 verse 7 tells us that he recovered eating a cake of figs. And who can forget Amos's humble declaration? In fact, one that I've heard a few times this week, but the last part has been left off. Amos said, "I am not a prophet, nor am I a son of a prophet, for I am a herdsman and a grower of sycamore figs." Amos 7:14. You remember that? Or even in the New Testament, where Nathanael was so impressed, declaring Jesus as the Messiah because Jesus saw Nathanael under the tree. But how many of us remember John 1:48 tells us it was a fig tree? In fact, I have a friend, a brother in Christ, that recently told me of an encounter with a fig tree he had as a small boy, a young boy. And apparently fig trees can get very, very big. In fact, their branches can get so big that it just kind of makes a canopy to where you could go inside and kind of hide yourself. And I'm not sure if that's what was so impressive Nathanael, that this tree was so big that he actually was escaping or hiding, just being by himself. There's no one that could have seen him there, so that when Jesus said, "I saw you," he knew that was impossible. That was a miracle in itself. James uses the fig tree, but this fig tree produces olives. And again, I think perhaps there is, for the people of Palestine, a connection there of the sweet taste of the fig and quite a different taste to the olive. This fig tree produces olives, and he uses that to discuss the problem of the tongue that blesses and curses. And even in Revelation chapter 6, verse 13, John witnessed a fig tree casting unripe figs as it was shaken by a great wind. These are just a few of the references to figs and fig trees in the Bible. Did you remember those? I didn't. But let's go to our story where Jesus does two things to a fig tree. Let's go to Mark chapter 11. Mark chapter 11, we're going to begin in verse 11, where Jesus curses and withers the fig tree. Now, this is a miracle that Jesus does the last week of his life, and I think it's important in our study that we look at what's happening in this last week, because I think it's significant in understanding all of this. So you have day number 1, Sunday, Jesus and his triumphant entry. And today we're talking about Jesus, his miracles, Jesus as the king. And we often point to that triumphant entry as a evidence of that. But if I'm also calculating this correctly, this is also the 10th day of Nisan. This would be the day that they would take the lamb that they were going to slaughter, that was going to be the Passover lamb. And so, not only is it his triumphant entry, but Israel has selected their Passover lamb in a way. And the text of the Passover says that they chose the lamb and they kept it. I'm not exactly sure what that meant. I always picture them maybe having to separate that lamb from the others and perhaps even keeping it in their house. And if that's the case, it's even significant because where does Jesus spend the week? He spends it in the house of God. Well, Mark tells us in verse 11, Mark 11:11, Jesus entered Jerusalem, came to the temple, and after looking around at everything, he left for Bethany with the 12, since it was already late. And so Sunday's over, and we come to day number 2, Monday. And in verse 12, on the next day when they had left Bethany, he became hungry. And seeing at a distance a fig tree and leaf, he went to see if perhaps he would find anything on it. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. That might be a little bit of an odd statement of why Jesus gets upset and so forth. I deal with that in the lecture. I'll let you read that. I'm not going to deal with it this morning. But notice verse 14. He said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." That's the curse. But notice Mark is very clear to tell us, and his disciples were listening. And so Jesus curses the fig tree on day number 2, Monday morning, on his way to Jerusalem. Now, there is a parallel account to this in Matthew, and his details are very much the same as Mark's. The biggest difference is Matthew records the cursing and the withering as happening all in one event, one time. Mark is more exact, more chronological, telling us the cursing happens on one day and the recognition of the withering happens on the next day. But going back to that Monday, verse 15, what does Jesus do as recorded by Mark on this Monday morning? He goes into Jerusalem and he drives out the money changers. I want you to hold that in your mind. We're going to come back to that a little bit later. And that's the only event that he records happening in Jerusalem, verse 19. And when evening came, they would go out of the city. So now we go to day number 3, Tuesday morning. And as they were passing by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots up. And being reminded, Peter said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree which you cursed has withered." Jesus answering, saying to them, and now Jesus brings out lessons. He said to them, have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken and cast in the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says is going to happen, it will be granted. And therefore I say to you, all things for which you pray and ask, believe that you have received them, and they will be granted to you. And whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father who is in heaven will also forgive you your transgressions. But if you do not forgive, neither will your Father who is in heaven forgive your transgressions. In verse 27, then they came to Jerusalem, and Jesus is asked, by what authority do these things? In fact, the majority of what is recorded about Jesus' teaching in this last week is recorded here on this particular Tuesday. And so he curses the fig tree one day, and they notice that it's withered the next. And he brings out lessons about faith. But what kind of faith? Faith that can move mountains. He brings out a lesson about prayer, but what kind of prayer? Confident prayer. And he brings out a lesson about merciful forgiveness. Those are the lessons Jesus speaks about. And I deal with them again in the lecture. I don't want to deal with them for sake of time this morning. You've preached on them. You've studied them. They're great lessons. But I do want to say this one thing. Sometimes we bring those lessons without putting them into their context. And they're powerful lessons, even when you do that. When you understand what's going on here, it just adds power to those and significance to them. And so here's my lesson this morning. Was Jesus upset because he was hungry? And so he cursed the fig tree? That wasn't it at all. Jesus had purpose, as he always did. Jesus made things into messages, and that's what this was. This was one of several things that Jesus did the last week of his life to tell Israel and to warn the apostles that judgment is coming. You see, that fig tree is Israel. And Jesus has two purposes here. In his last week, one, he is he's telling the people why the fig tree is going to be cursed and withered, why judgment is coming, and it's because of what they had become. They are a fruitless fig tree. But also because of the very things that they're going to do to Jesus later that week. Judgment is coming. The king must judge. And here's the ironic thing, is that there will be hope for these people that kill the Son of God. There'll be hope to escape that judgment and to survive. But the hope comes from the very one that they kill that Friday morning. The second thing Jesus is doing is, like he is here, it is the disciples, it is the apostles that are listening. He is warning them, some of them who themselves will be there in Jerusalem to witness this. He wants them to be prepared. He wants them to be able to escape. And so when you think about this judgment that happens in AD 70 and the destruction of Jerusalem, and as he says in Matthew 24, it's not just that particular judgment, but there are things that are going to happen. People are going to change. It is now time to take a money belt and even a sword, Jesus says, in these next 40 years. It makes sense, doesn't it? That when Jesus curses and withers the fig tree, that the lessons he brings out is faith that moves mountains, and prayer that is confident, and forgiveness that is merciful, because those are going to be the recipes of success for the apostles. They're going to need those these next 40 years. They're great lessons, but when you understand what they're going to face in this context, it has even more significance for them and for us. There's a judgment still to come. How do we prepare? How do we get ready? How do we conquer? It's these lessons right here. But the remainder of our time, I want to talk about the more subtle message that Jesus delivers. And that is the evidence that that's exactly what Jesus was bringing about, a warning and a message that judgment is coming, and it is all seen in this miracle of the cursing, the withering, the fig tree. The next question I want to ask you is this. Why would Jesus use a fig tree? I mean, like I said already, the figs and fig trees don't just leap off the pages of the Bible. And this seems so subtle. In fact, it's so subtle that you probably just really haven't even noticed. You kind of read right through this and didn't think too much about the fig tree and what Jesus does to that. You went on to his words on that particular Tuesday and looked at those. But I'd like to suggest to you that what is subtle to us would not be so subtle to the Jews of that day. This was language and a metaphor that they heard quite often. It was a language and metaphor that comes right out of the Old Testament, especially the prophets. In fact, Jeremiah uses the metaphor of the withered fig tree more than any other prophet. And doesn't that make sense? Doesn't that seem appropriate? Because Jeremiah is Judah's last hope. He is the prophet that prophesies and warns them about the coming destruction of Jerusalem. And in fact, he is there to witness the very destruction, the very fulfillment of his words. But let's take a look at some of these references in the Old Testament. Let's go to Isaiah 34, if you would. Isaiah 34. Now, in this passage, this is not words of judgment for Judah, but this is actually for the nations. He's going to judge the nations. And so in Isaiah 34, verse 2, the Lord's indignation is against all nations. His wrath is against all their armies. He has utterly destroyed them. He has given them over to slaughter. Judgment's coming. So look, if you would, at verse 4. What's it going to be like? What's going to happen? He says, all the hosts of heaven will wear away, and the sky will be rolled up like a scroll, and all their hosts will also wither away. This reminds us so much of Matthew 24, where he talks about the destruction of Jerusalem and what's going to happen and what's going to be like, what's going to happen before it. And people often look at those things where the things are happening in the sky and the stars and the moon and all that. That's just judgment language, and you see it right here. The sky will be rolled up like a scroll, and their hosts will also wither away. But look at what he says next. As a leaf withers from the vine, or as one withers from the fig tree. That's the way it's going to be. Notice we got the vine and the fig tree both withering together. Let's go over to Jeremiah. Jeremiah chapter 5, verse 17. Let's look at the way Jeremiah uses this. Now in Jeremiah chapter 5, why is this judgment coming? Because things are bad, really bad. Look at verse 1. God, through Jeremiah, says to Judah, roam to and fro through the streets of Jerusalem. Notice the emphasis, Jerusalem. And look now and take note and seek in her open squares. If you can find a man, if there is one who does justice, who seeks truth, then I will pardon her. It kind of reminds you of Abraham's discussion with God, doesn't it? If there's 40 righteous, 30 righteous, 20, he gets him down to 10. God doesn't do that. He says, if there's just one, I won't do this. He didn't even find one. And so in chapter 5, verse 15, behold, I'm bringing a nation against you from afar. And describes that nation, an enduring nation, ancient nation, a nation whose language you do not know. And what will they do? What will it look like? What will it be? Verse 17, they will devour your harvest and your food. They will devour your sons and your daughters. They will devour your flocks and your herds. They're devouring everything, but it makes sense as well. They will devour your vine and your fig trees. They will demolish with the sword your fortified cities in which you trust. Turn with me, if you would, now to Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 13. Jeremiah 8, verse 13. Judgment's coming because the people are guilty. Who's guilty? Look at verse 1 again. At that time declares the Lord, they will bring out the bones of the kings of Judah, the bones of its princes, the bones of the priests, the bones of the prophets, the bones of the inhabitants of Jerusalem from their graves. Everyone's guilty, from the king down, priest, prophet, all the people. How bad had it gotten? Look, if you would, at verse 12. Passage we're well aware of. Were they ashamed because of the abomination they had done? They certainly were not ashamed. They did not know how to blush. And therefore they shall fall among those who fall. And at the time of punishment they shall be brought down, says the Lord. I will surely snatch them away, declares the Lord. There will be no grapes on the vine, and no figs on the fig tree, and the leaf will wither away, and what I have given them will pass away. Notice again, the vine and the fig, they produce no fruit. Joel chapter 1, it's not just the major prophets who use it, but the minor prophets as well. Joel chapter 1, Joel sees the judgment coming like a locust invasion. And in verse 7, he says, these locusts what? The judgment has come. It has made my vine a waste, and my fig tree splinters. It has stripped them bare and cast them away. Their branches have become white. And let's take a look at one more. There's so many we could look at. But one of my favorites, Habakkuk. We're going to look at Habakkuk chapter 3, the last few verses of Habakkuk. But you know Habakkuk. Habakkuk says to God, look at your people. They're evil. They're terrible. Do something. And God says, okay, I am doing something. I'm bringing the Babylonians. And Habakkuk says, no, not that. I don't like that. And chapter 3, which is a song, is written in poetry. Habakkuk finally comes to the resolve that he's got to let God do what God's going to do. And he's got to do what he's got to do. Look, if you would, at verse 17. Though the fig tree should not blossom, says Habakkuk, and there be no fruit on the vines, though the yield of the olive should fail, and the fields produce no food, though the flock should cut off from the fold, there be no cattle in the stalls, yet I will exalt in the Lord. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength, and he has made my feet like hinds' feet. He makes me walk on my high places. even when we don't like the will of God, the way of God, that needs to be our resolve. So what was so subtle to us? What we might miss, they would not. I'm not sure the apostles got it right on that day, but they would. They put it all together. This is what they've heard over and over. And so going back to Mark chapter 11, Jesus cursing and withering the fig tree. The next question I want to ask you is, what was on Jesus' mind? I really believe that to understand the meaning and the message of the cursing and the withering of the fig tree, that it has to be studied in the context of all that Jesus does on this last week. So what was on his mind? And this was another part of the study that really just never appeared to me as strongly as it did. There were probably several things on Jesus' mind, but one thing that's clear on his mind was that destruction of Jerusalem that was coming, that judgment day that was coming. Again, telling the people why it's coming and warning his disciples that they would be ready. I want to read these because I want you to hear the language. The triumphant entry, first day, his entrance into Jerusalem. Mark tells us that he looked around and he left, but Luke tells us before he left, he said these words, Luke 19, 42 through 44. Listen to these words by the judge, by the king. If you had known in this day, even you, the things which made for peace, but now they have been hidden from your eyes. For the day shall come upon you when your enemies will throw up a bank before you and surround you and hem you in on every side, and will level you to the ground. And look at this, and your children within you. And they will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not recognize the time of your visitation. I always thought that the language of that one stone not left upon another didn't happen until Matthew 24, but it actually happens even earlier, even at the triumphant entry. Look, if you would, later on in, I believe it's the Tuesday, Jesus lets the Pharisees and the scribes have, he calls them hypocrites. But even in the midst of that language, in Matthew 23, 37, 39, look at what he says. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. For I say to you, from now on you shall not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Number one, it's clearly on his mind. But did you see what he said? This is not the king saying to those who have rejected him, you're going to get what you deserve. He says, I wanted to gather you like a mother hen gathers her chicks. That's what I wanted to do. But you would have nothing to do with that. Jesus shows his love and his care. It was them that refused to have it. We know that Jesus talks about the destruction of Jerusalem and what was going to happen before it. In fact, in Matthew 24, verse 15, Jesus used the words of Daniel 11:31, Daniel 12:11, about the abomination of desolation. But Luke records Jesus saying it this way, Luke 21, verse 20, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is at hand. If there's any confusion about what this chapter is talking about, if it's still in the future or it's already happened, that clarifies it right there. But back in Matthew 24, Jesus actually, in his words about the destruction of Jerusalem, Matthew 24, 32 and 33, makes a parable. But look at what he says, the parable. Now learn the parable of what? The fig tree. When its branches has already become tender and it puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. Even so, you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Jesus uses the parable of the fig tree as a sign of when they know it's happening. What about on the way to the cross? Even the way of the cross, he's not thinking just of himself. He's thinking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Look, if you would, at Luke chapter 23, 28 through 31. Jesus sees some women of Jerusalem weeping and mourning for what's happening to him. And he stops and he turns and he says, daughters of Jerusalem, stop weeping for me. But weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do these things in the green tree, what will happen in the dry? Notice those last words. If they do these things in the green tree while it's alive, what will happen in the dry when it's dying? You can see clearly by Jesus' words that this was on his mind throughout the week, even on his way to the cross. But it's not just his words that show us, it is his actions. The cursing and the withering of the fig tree is not just a message. In fact, Jesus doesn't really even bring out the message except for the words of the curse. It's more of what we call a sign act that again was very common among the prophets. A sign act that was a visual of the message itself. Jeremiah was told in Jeremiah 13 that he was to lay every day on a certain side in front of all the people for a total of 300 I got that backwards. That was Ezekiel chapter 4, for 390 days. And then when 390 days were over, he would switch over to the right side and he would sleep on his right side for 40 days. And you can imagine that the people are walking by day after day and what is this crazy prophet doing? And he would then deliver the message in connection to the sign act. Jeremiah in Jeremiah 13 was told to take a girdle, a waistband, and to go to the Euphrates River and to put it behind a rock and leave it there for a certain amount of time. And then he was told to go back and get it, and when he got it, he pulled it, and it was ruined. It was good for nothing. And he took that back to Jerusalem. And as he was speaking to them, the words of God, he said, this is the way God sees you. A worthless, ruined girdle. A fruitless fig tree. And I believe Jesus does at least two sign acts in this last week. First, the one we're talking about, the cursing and the withering of the fig tree, was a sign act. It was a visual message. But the second one was the driving out of the money changers, which interestingly happens right in the middle. There's the cursing and the withering, and the driving out of the money changers happens right in between that as Mark records it. It's a sign act. Just like the cursing of the fig tree, which reveals the reason for the coming of God's wrath. In fact, some don't look at that as a cleansing of the temple at all. That perhaps the first one he did at the beginning of his ministry was a cleansing of the temple, a warning to get things right, to clean it up. But many see this second one not as a cleansing, but as a cursing of the temple. In other words, Jesus was not coming to put the temple back in proper function, but to give a visual, give a sign act that it was too late. It would only be a short time before the temple would be destroyed, because they had made it into a robber's den. And so my last question for us this morning is, what does this mean for us? When we understand the message, we understand what was on Jesus' mind, we start to look at that fig tree as we never seen it before, and it brings out a great lesson for us. We have a king that judges. And that's what a beloved king does. That's the job of a king, at least one of them. You see that throughout the Bible, throughout the Old Testament. But our king judges in fairness. He brings justice. Our king cannot let things remain crooked. He must straighten them. But he is a king that judges, and before he judges, he warns. He gives time. He is patient. He wants to protect his people. He wants to keep them away from this. He wants them to bring the self-correction. And as we look at Jesus, not only with the fig tree, but with the events of what Jesus does in this last week, when we look at his words, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you see a king, you see a judge with love and compassion, who wants to bring all those that are in sin, who are lost. He wants to bring them like a mother hen under his wings, under his protection, under his salvation. So the next time you see a tree, doesn't have to be a fig tree. Next time you see a tree, especially one that is withered, dead, not producing fruit anymore, I want you to remember we have a king. He will judge. I want you to remember those words, that he may not speak them to us. May you never bear fruit again. I don't want to hear those words. But remember Jesus and the fig tree, because for us, he is not the judge of a nation. We know that he is the judge of the world yet to come. Thank you very much.